You're a real weenie if you can't do all these things. And so if you already struggle with that, you're like, I'm out. I'm not gonna go through this process that just validates the way that I feel already. Ding dong, your front door, your doorbell, your front door rings, and guess who's there? It's one of your best clients. Why is it your best client? Because everything that you've given him, he responds to perfectly. High intensity exercise, no problem. High skill movements, great. Nutrition, does everything you ask. And then all of a sudden, he stops progressing. What do? Go.
I ask him, what's changed?
And are you sitting here telling me that as a fitness professional, you have to look at something besides fitness to answer that question?
It's funny. It's funny how that happens.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're sitting here across from the table telling me that our job as fitness professionals has more to do than just fitness?
Contrary to popular belief, yeah.
Well, that's what we call a hot start in the business. And I'm here with...
Mar. Mar on the mic.
With Mar.
Mar Bruce. I feel like last time we talked a lot about my old last name.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bruce is the new one.
Well, and since last time, you've gotten really popular. And so, those followers of yours need to know that you're a married woman. We don't want to have any misconceptions here.
Mom, thanks for watching the video 100 times.
Mom, thanks for all those views. We're here to talk about stress and the basics of that, the implications of that, the misconceptions, and then what our job is as health professionals, as coaches that are speaking into multiple dimensions of what it means to be healthy. And so this is a topic that we'll just scratch the surface with today because there's a lot to it. But it's something that you and I have had lots of conversations about because that little anecdote of a story that we started with is something that has happened quite a bit. It's something that I think every health and fitness professional can relate to, is that they make these prescriptions and they could be very specific actions, which we'll get to, which is better than just saying, hey, make sure you exercise and make sure you eat real food, which is where a lot of health professionals stop. We can be very specific with the prescriptions and yet still, one, it doesn't work, or two, they don't do it. So where do you want to start?
Gosh, so let's just talk about what stress is.
Okay, great. What is stress?
Well, I mean, I think you can easily break it down by just saying this. It's the sensation that you get based off of stressors, right? So there's the difference between the reaction, which is actual stress, and then the actual stressors that you could quickly just break it into. I mean, you could break it into four, but we'll just say two categories, right? Like the outside factors, that is time, family, work, projects, traffic, things like that. And then the internal stressors like self-image, inner critic, all the other things that we experience internally inside of us that aren't based off of outside factors.
Yeah, that's a great way to simplify. Precision nutrition talks about deep health, and there's like 6 categories of stressors, which is even hard to like memorize. But I think just breaking it down to, hey, there's stuff that can arise outside of you, and then there's things that can come up from inside of you is a really simple way to describe that. And furthermore, like a stress biologically is anything that disrupts homeostasis, which is just a cute way of saying like any type of stimulus that's happening to you, the body has to respond to.
Mm-hmm. It like sees it as a threat.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. Even this light above our heads, the temperature of the room, even basic things like the sound of the speakers outside of here, that's a stimulus that our body has to navigate. It's what keeps us alive. And thinking of all these things combined, there's a really fancy word that you can use to impress your friends or at your next dinner party, and it's called allostatic or allostatic load. And I think it's a great term to be familiar with because it represents that stress isn't just, hey, I did a workout and now I'm tired, or my boss was yelling at me, but there is a constant amount of input that your body is dealing with. And what's even more interesting is that we don't all respond to the same stimulus the same way. Mm. Now, there's basic stuff like, the light above our heads that our eyes calibrate. In yours and mine, I have these really sophisticated glasses on, so I probably respond differently than you do. But outside of that, like it's probably the same. But things like cognitive stress and even physical stress, there's a big discrepancy in how we respond. And so it makes this a very complicated topic. It means that truly, like, one size doesn't fit all in some of these protocols and some of the things that we would prescribe as a defense against this huge pervasive problem that is like worldwide. Mm. So why do you think that this is something that everybody's struggling with?
Everybody struggles with stress because they don't know how to manage stress.
So it's a management issue.
I think we know it exists, but we don't have the tools to actually know how to make a change. Mm-hmm. We know we can feel it. I mean, you just said it, like it shows up for everyone a little bit differently. So to say like how to manage stress as a one size fits all is inappropriate.
Mm-hmm. And probably a big distinction between, because this is one of the many biological processes that we've had for a long, long time. But today it's operating differently. Instead of these huge sympathetic nervous responses to bring, life-altering stress down, we would all agree that that's typically not the case, that most of the time it is something that's environmental. It's something that's more psychological in nature. And, some of the research out there says that it's because there's no real distinction between when things should be stressful, like, we're running from a lion, mm-hmm. and then the recovery part of, hey, I'm now in safety. I was out in the, plains by myself, and now I'm here with my tribe, and I know I'm safe. And so now this has not just signaled physically that I'm okay, but mentally I'm also safe. Mm. For us, there's very little distinction between stress, and for some of us, this period of recovery, of relaxation, of celebration, that I'm okay, is never fully there. And some of that is because we're constantly attached to work, we're constantly attached to stimulus, and so there isn't this very clear signal that we should be in recovery mode. Mm. I do a workout, that's stressful. I'm looking at my phone 7 times while I work out. There's stimulus, there's input that I know I have to deal with. There's a physical stress. There's now a cognitive stress. I leave and it's hot outside. It's an environmental stress. All of these things add up. And then even when I transition to go home, I'm not even signaling to myself like, hey, you get to chill out. But it's like game on to the next thing, and then game on to the next thing. And so the reason that this is such a pervasive issue is because we're being inundated, and it's this constant influx of stimulus, right, if that's what stress is. And like you said, we're more than likely successfully handling the stress. That's the stimulus. But we're not doing anything to clear the stressors that have built up as a response to the input. That was quite a monologue, but I think we're on the right track here.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, to kind of take a step back, important to note what this stress cycle it is that you're even talking about, like the input of the stimulus, how to decompress from that, or what it looks like to even, completely like miss the cycle in general of just starting right back where you ended the day before. To go back to your lion and tribe analogy, right? There's two ways that story could go. If you're running from a lion, you kill the lion, you go back to your tribe with this lion, you cook the lion, you celebrate it, you're completing the stress cycle. You went from that fight or flight, you went in with your tribe, and now you're celebrating the success, and your body's able to completely recover from that fight or flight situation, right? But what is a more common cycle that we see with most people, I mean, myself included, is that we see the lion, we hit fight or flight, we run from the lion, we see a cave, we hide from the lion goes away, and then we stay in this constant fear of, will that lion come back? Is the lion behind me? And so that's to kind of put in perspective. And every day you go to work, you handle a hard project, you go home, you step right into being a spouse, you never fully complete this cycle. And so you start the next day thinking back on, hey, I have that project, that meeting, I have to go home, be a good spouse. And then the cycle continues to repeat. And then 7 days in, your spouse drops chicken nuggets on the floor and you're like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you like want to break up with them, but you can't because
Punch him right in the stomach.
it was just chicken nuggets on the ground, And I say that
There's
because
a story for you, Mom.
Don't worry, Spencer, I still love you. Others, Spencer.
Man, we need to clarify
so
that.
Confusing.
Okay. All right.
He's married. I'm married. There are two Spencers and a Kelly.
Yeah, so when she says, I love you, Spencer, you're talking about your husband.
Yes.
And not the person.
Spencer Bruce.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Back to the story. But I think that story can resonate with so many people. You allow your work stress to build and build and build and build. Your spouse, your dog, your kid does something just super insignificant, and all of a sudden you blow up on them. Why? Well, because you never actually dealt with that stress. To take a step back, if you go to work, you hit a project, you come home, to go back to the celebrating of the killing of the lion, you come home, you take a couple moments to breathe well. Maybe you take the dog on a walk without your cell phone and you think and you breathe. Or what is a more common thing that I deal with is clients, they go to work, they have a stressful day, they come here and they exercise. And so that stress cycle stops. Because the best way to approach stress is, I read in a book like Body Language, and I loved that because it meant that it could be truly just breathing better. It could be exercise. They say exercise is the number one way to deal with stress well. And there's even a good way to deal with stress with exercise, and we'll get to that later. And they even mention affection, 20-second hugs, 6-second kisses. Don't kiss your clients, that'd be weird. But maybe with your spouse, right? And then they even mention creative expression, drawing, writing, coloring, things like that. And so I mention that because those are the two stories. You either let that cycle completely keep going and going and going till you fully explode, and then you do it again. And then that's how you just live life. Or you start to implement ways to de-stress. And in a perfect world, right, we do that every single day. We get home, we have a good routine, and we know what we need to do to de-stress. Right? But sometimes we don't even know that's what we're dealing with. And that kind of takes it into why you have coaches in the first place. Why you, as a coach, you have to ask the right questions. Why it isn't just about how you're exercising, how you're eating, so on and so forth.
Yeah, the longer that we do this, the more this becomes the thing that is the top priority. And I know that's weird because if you're coaching in a gym, you say like, well, isn't it actually producing more stress for them? Isn't my job to administer these highly stressful workouts so their body can adapt and improve? And I would say that's a really low resolution thought of everything that's happening. Yes, you want workouts to be just challenging enough, but there's a lot of gray area in doing something that's a stimulus for our clients and then producing something that when you look at the full bucket of load of stress, you actually did them a disservice by dosing them with more of what they already had in excess.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of it is, like you're describing, figuring out if there's this, valve of pressure, like basically how to release that pressure all throughout the day and all throughout the week. But then it's also thinking like, well, what am I doing that's putting more and more pressure into the system to begin with, right? So it's inputs like versus outputs.
Mm-hmm.
And for us as coaches, like both of those are things that we need to be coaching through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say more than our responsibility, probably primarily, is to make sure that we're not introducing more pressure than they can handle.
Yeah, 100%.
But it's also educating them on the ways with which we're going to try to release this pressure. And here's the thing that, in my opinion, we should probably, spend the most time talking about: how to get them to actually do that. Because I was thinking on the way here, all this stuff is really boring. All of the things that we're about to get into, except for the, 20-second hugs and the 6-second kisses, telling somebody like, hey, I'd really like you to get some more sleep, is something that maybe there's some people out there that don't know that. Be like, are you telling me there's the amount of sleep I need? Maybe there's somebody like that out there, but I think for the most part, it's like this is the most rote, common knowledge that is in existence. Yet it's probably the biggest failure for most people. Everybody knows you should be sleeping. Everybody knows you should be breathing. These are things that are so simple and they're so basic that we discount them and we don't do them in favor of some other behavior. Mm. And so I think, the recommendations or the ways that we can modify this for adherence, to me, is the most interesting part. It's not the what, it's the how that captivates me.
For sure. And that's the funny part of this, and like talking about coaching stress, right? Is because you would never just give a template programming to someone who has personal needs, and you would never give a template for nutrition for someone who has personal needs. Like I would never give a vegetarian a carnivore diet template by any means, right? Mm-hmm. That's inappropriate. And so why would we think that we need to do the same thing for people dealing with stress, to just say like, oh, you need to breathe, you need to sleep? They'd be like, okay, well, what if I do get 8 hours of sleep? What does that actually look like? Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the miss is at the beginning of even coaching this. It's getting the right amount of information needed to then be able to prescribe like, hey, is it the 20-second hug that you really do need to de-stress? Or is it taking a step back in training and it's a less intense, a less additive of a stressor, and instead something that allows you to breathe a little bit better? Mm-hmm. But it takes, again, getting the right intake, getting to know that person a little more, asking the right questions to be able to know what this proper prescription is for stress.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking of this visual, and I have never said this out loud, so it may not land. But this thing that we're talking about, I think it can be applied to all these different dimensions of health. And there's one cog, if there's like these gears where like the teeth like interconnect, and so, you turn one and it makes the others turn. The biggest cog is like B-E. And that's like be healthy. Mm. And everybody knows that. There isn't a human over the age of 4 that doesn't know they're supposed to be healthy. A much smaller cog is to do these things like exercise and eat and breathe and sleep. And most people like know that. And that's where I think a lot of health practitioners and people with great intentions just stop. And they're like, hey, make sure you get 8 hours of sleep. Hey, make sure you're exercising 3 times a week. Make sure you're eating your vegetables. But for anybody that's been doing this for more than like 2 weeks, you realize that that's a really ineffective place to stop for people. And if that's all you're doing is sitting down with somebody, be like, hey, I really want you to try to get more sleep. Worthless.
Mm-hmm.
Worthless information. And so the smallest cog are the actual actions. It's the actual behavior modifications, because our job breaks down to behavior modification. Do you want to know the other things I have in my my
keep
visual?
Going,
okay.
Keep going. Okay, so I got this one up here.
So the little actions, that's based on like the goals that we want. But there's also the exact opposite behavior. Let's say that we've given a very specific prescription for sleep, very detailed, and they don't do it. In fact, we speak with somebody and we say, hey, you've been getting in bed at midnight and you're getting up at 5 a.m. And we know, we have agreed that you are really motivated to improve your body composition, and we realize that our limiting factor is stress, the fact that you're not recovering well enough. And we really believe that they believe that. Like, we're on the same page. This is not a lack of motivation, and you're not doing this because I'm telling you to. You really want this. There's a self-determined aspect going on, and they still don't do it. And I believe the reason is there's an anti-goal. There's a behavior that's the exact opposite of sleep that at that moment
feels better,
is way more enticing and motivating than the sleep, even though they know conceptually that's the right thing to do. So some ingredients of an anti-goal, I think, are you know better.
Mm.
You feel like at that moment, you don't care that you know better, and you find yourself doing it. And I think this is a really important thing to dig into, because it comes back to this decision fatigue. It comes back to having so much pressure in the system already that every behavior tells a story. You staying up late despite you knowing better tells a story. And I think as coaches, our inexperience or insecurity, it's quick to write those people off. And we say, they didn't really want it. Oh, they thought they were motivated. They thought they had the right intentions. They don't really want it. But it's way more complicated than that, right? We've already established that person, it's not a motivation, but it's something else going on. So I think that's a big part. And then, there's probably something to be said about barriers that get in the way. If we're talking about the sleep analogy, if you know all of these things are right, but you have a spouse that's also had a highly stressful day, and she is telling you, hey, can we just turn this iPad on in bed and just chill out? Can we just disconnect from the world but not go to sleep just yet? It's like this revenge that your body's going through in revolution to the hard day that you just had. Is that good? It's like, hey, I know I'm supposed to do this, but I'm going to do the most punk rock thing right now because you just put me through the ringer all day. So I know that you want me to go to sleep. I'm going to stay up. I'm going to stay up and watch this stupid ass show on Netflix that I don't care at all about. How many times as a coach have you had that conversation with somebody?
Oh, geez.
It happens all the time. Okay, I'll end that rant.
So what do we do?
Well, that's a good question. I think one, we've established why stress is real, its insidious nature. we've even touched on some of the misconceptions or things that as facilitators are ineffective. And so let's just jump right into ways that you actually can do something about this. So we've broken down the what and the why. Let's get into the how, because I think the value of this podcast that we're doing is trying to leave coaches and even just human beings that care about this stuff with ways that you can implement this versus just knowledge and education.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, along that line, where do you want to start?
I mean, let's go exercise. Let's back to our good friend that we talked about when we started this morning. High intensity for years has been dialed in on nutrition, and all of a sudden something changes, which shameless plug here, but I think that's the most important part of having a coach in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like your life is going to ebb and flow. And if you don't have somebody that knows what you've been through and can coach you differently, then you're just going to be sat there guessing instead of having somebody to guide you through it instead.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, back to our friend who's been doing this high intensity workout, met with a different season of life, hitting a high amount of stress. I think it's important to talk about ways to even de-stress training.
That's great. That's a big misconception, I think, because we know, and it's true, that in order for, super compensation to happen, the stimulus has to be intense enough for our bodies to respond and say, okay, I need to disrupt this in order to, increase some biological metric. But there's a lot of space there. There's a lot of ways to go about that. And I think what even the most tenured exercise scientist won't be able to tell you is what the minimum effective dose is. And that's different than what I thought when I first started training people. I thought it was the maximum effective dose.
Mm-hmm.
And let me give the max here. But as people age out, as people transition from being 22 and having the ability, and I'm talking about myself, not Isaiah, but the ability to do 2 workouts and to be at the gym for 3 hours, to transition out of that is to say that the training that we do shouldn't be stressful or as stressful in a few different ways. Now, you can have something that's physically very challenging, but psychologically, it doesn't cause distress. And I think that's a great thing to tinker with in what we're talking about.
Yeah.
You can have 2 people squatting 100 kilos, exact same body type, exact same pace, exact same rhythm, and that could be really stressful for one person, and it could be a walk in the park for the other. So one factor of this would be experience, right? What are some other things, without me, going overboard, what are some other things that you have found that when you find this person, it's like, okay, this baseline prescription, it's no longer appropriate? What are some things that you found to be really helpful here? And we're talking about the experienced athlete.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it like maximum effort versus minimum effort. And I think sometimes we get in our head that training has to look a certain way. Training has to look like 3 hours a day. Training has to look like really complex movements done for speed and high intensity, right? We think that that's the only way to exercise well. And the reality is there's so many ways to exercise that aren't stressful for the body. I gave a great example earlier to my friend Caleb, but the moments where we're high level, high stress, and we add more stress, our body just sees it as stress and it's stress on stress. But if we have the ability to still move our bodies with a low heart rate, where our body's able to calm down and we're able to take ourselves from here to here, great example, sit on a bike, nose breathe for 30 minutes, like that is still a really great workout that instead of adding stress to the body, allows you to really breathe, reset, and move forward with a little bit more clear thinking. I think a lot of times, it would be like me asking you to do Fran and then asking you like very personal questions about yourself. Like you'd be like, I'm up here. I don't know what you're asking of me, right? But if I'm asking you post 30 minutes of nose breathing where you're nice and calm. Like you might have something really philosophical to share with me because you've had time to de-stress and your mind's thinking a little bit clearer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so very specific protocols that someone could take and implement is to think, how might we produce a great stimulus, but decrease the psychological distress that this could cause. Mm-hmm. And so some things that you mentioned are heart rate variability, giving adequate time to recover. And we could take the inverse of that, right? How would we want to make something really stressful? We would decrease the rest. We would increase the rate of perceived exertion. We would more than likely increase the skill of the movement. We would isolate them, right? All those are ways that we could instantly stress somebody the F out. Mm-hmm. And so the opposite, we should recognize we have carte blanche and permission to customize and administer to our clients. And something that I think gets often overlooked, and this is a beautiful way to personalize, is to ask them what they think is fun, because that's also really relative.
Totally.
And you and I have talked about this as well. For one person, well, I'll use my wife as an example. The way that she wants to just disconnect through exercise to de-stress is by running for 30 minutes. And if I wanted to come up with the thing that would be the most stressful for me, biologically based on this, it would be running for 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. For me, it's a workout like we did yesterday. It's resistance training, it's bodybuilding type movements, it's lots of rest in between, still high exertion. But for my wife, that's the last thing on earth that she wants to do. That's really stressful for her. And so I think in addition to these metrics of programming, rest, load, volume, level of perceived exertion, that's all one thing. But then even just to get the client's input, hey, Johnny Jojo, as we're thinking about programming now, I want to hear some things that you think are really stressful, really hard, really challenging for you. And then I want to hear some things that you really enjoy. And you have that in your arsenal. You have that in your toolkit. So as times crop up where you get the message and be like, hey, I was up all last night, but I still want to come in and work. You know that you can dip into that modification jar of things that he actually finds enjoyable. So when they come in, it's not an added stress. Now, there's still biological things happening, but it's not something that we have to get like so worked up for cognitively that it's just putting more pressure in the valve than we need to. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about nutrition? Yeah. So, exercise, it's one decision for that day. Mm-hmm. We're saying, and just to reiterate what you've already said, that exercise is this is undisputed. It's the number one mechanism mm-hmm. to release stress mm-hmm. and to get us out of the cycle of constant input. But typically that's only one decision that day. Yeah. Nutrition, as we said before, it's multiple decisions. Mm-hmm. So what are some things that you would recommend if you realize that this is the limiting factor that your client has from a nutritional standpoint?
Yeah, I think the first thing to acknowledge when it comes to nutrition and stress is what's actually happening to the body when you are stressed. Your immune system's down, your metabolism, or the way your food is being broken down even decreases. So all of those things begin to happen when you're stressed. So it's even more important to be focusing in on nutrition at the time. And to go back on how to de-stress it, if we're seeing someone who's not getting results and we're like, oh, it's stress, the last thing you want to do is be like, all right, like macro count and count every single gram because you're not getting results and I'm going to get you results in this super stressful period. And I think your job as a coach is actually to make nutrition so simple mm-hmm. that there's no way that they can't actually execute this well. And a lot of it is, I keep going back to asking questions, right? But number one is, what are they currently doing that's not working? Is it, hey, I'm thinking so much about macros that I'm actually going home and I'm just completely binge eating because I'm so stressed out and the thought of weighing my food, I'm just going to eat everything I first see when I walk in the door. And so instead of being like, okay, well, I need you to weigh and measure these things, take a step back, make it super simple. Hey, when you get home today, I want you to focus on one thing and one thing only during this season. I want you to not reach to the pantry first. That's it. And then you can add a little bit more, right? If that's like, okay, well, that feels silly. Like, hey, when you get home today, the first thing I want you to do is pick your protein of choice. That's it. I want you to eat that first. And if you're still hungry, well, then reach for a little bit more of, well, we'd say a carb is, reach for a little bit of rice. Oh, you want a little more? Start to eat some veggies. And then when you feel full, that's it. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. And I think what helps is instead of being like, here's all the things and I need you to rigidly do them, it's to take a step back and say, hey, here's your one focus when you get home. And it might, for some people, truly in stressful seasons, it might be, hey, your one thing is to not go through a drive-through.
Yeah. A client's autonomy, which a good definition of that is like, someone's self-directed ability to do the thing that you're saying is really important. And what you're talking about is someone's competence, right? Their ability to do the thing that you're asking. And how many times have we asked something and it's actually done the exact opposite? Instead of being good for them, it's actually stressed them out. Someone who won't be named, but we were talking about this just last week, a guy that is dialed into a very specific race. His compliance with training is very high. We asked him to weigh and measure his food, which seemed appropriate because of his self-determined nature for everything else, and he was incapable of doing it.
Yeah.
And the modification from there is, hey, we want you just to go buy these pre-established meals, and hey, we just want you to eyeball this, and it was no problem. And one of the things that I think's hard with coaching is that in our brains it makes complete sense that we would start with these certain behaviors, and then often we make mistakes and we have to iterate out of those. I think a great question to ask before you give the specific behavior that you want them to comply with is to say, how difficult do you think this will be for you? And that question can be very insightful because you said a couple of don'ts. Hey, I don't want you to go through a drive-through. How difficult would that be for you? Well, I live next to a drive-through. Oh, my wife's the manager of Chick-fil-A. That's going to be really hard for me not to do that. Okay, copy that. Hey, don't go into the pantry. How difficult will that be for you? Well, I don't have shit in my pantry, so it'll be pretty easy. Oh, I have 4 kids and they eat goldfish and there's cereal and there's all these things that I love. That's going to be really difficult for me. And so the answer to that will give you further insight of how you need to reduce this down or even pivot and go in a completely different direction, which I think because we're bound to not nail this the first time, that's a way that can save both of you just a lot of heartache and disappointment because this is a complicated thing, right? Because from a motivation standpoint, if we could back up just for a sec, the worst level is I don't want to do anything you're saying and I'm not going to do it, right? And most of the time we're not dealing with people because we didn't force anybody to come in here. Ever so often we'll have someone that comes from Baylor just right down the street and they say, man, my doctor said that, I'm going to get diabetes if I don't do this stuff. And they still don't do it. And it's because they're in that stage of a motivation. It means I don't care. Even though I know I'm supposed to, I don't care. And if we can't get past that, it's going to be really hard. But there are different stages. And the very next stage, I would say, is I'm doing this because you've told me to do it, which isn't self-determined. It's others determined. And that's a lot more common. People don't want to admit that. But there's a lot of people that have come in here where they are going to attempt to do these things, but it's not because they have a real reason for that. From there, it's still others determined, but it's even more insidious. It's based on shame. It's based on guilt. It's based on the imposter syndrome. I think that the fitness industry is fueled by the imposter syndrome. Now, from there, this is where we start to get into really healthy behaviors. And God, we could spend a whole episode on this right here, but you have decided, and we've started to scratch the surface here, you've decided that you like to exercise. Instead of it being this really stressful, high intensity, cookie cutter, corporate, boring pageantry, you realize, man, for me, there's some things that I really like. After I get a little sweat, after I move some blood around, man, I actually perform better at work. Or, man, if I can go for a little walk, like we said, if I can release the stress in my life with this thing, turns out it makes all these other things better. And then the very final level would be, I do this and it makes me feel good, and I'm going to keep doing it because these things are important to me. So that's a whole category of just motivation. But I share that because I think it's important to know where someone is. If they're at that last level, hey, go and weigh and measure your food. How difficult is that going to be for you? Not difficult at all, coach. Got it. But I can almost bank that if you prescribe something and they can't do it, it may have something to do with them not being at the level that you thought that they were at. Mm-hmm. That was just a little reel for Instagram right there. Yeah, I just want to.
Yeah, so I think that for coaches coaching clients that are dealing with these high levels of stresses, I think it's an easy roadmap to success once you know the tools. I think it's one, establishing the stressor. I think it's two, figuring out ways to combat the stress. Is it making exercise easier? Is it making nutrition easier? And I don't mean like easier in the sense of lame and dumb and won't produce results, but complexity. Like it doesn't have to be hard for it to be good. And it doesn't have to be perfect for it to be good. And so taking the complexity down. And then four, it's testing it. It's saying, hey, did that work? It's following up, like you mentioned. Like, hey, you said that was going to be easy. Was it easy? Wasn't easy. Maybe we're not there yet. Let's take a step back. I think sometimes people think, hey, once I've gotten to macros and high intensity, 3 hours a day of training, like nothing else is better than this. And the reality is you can take the complexity down. You can make it easier and still produce better results at the same time.
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect in what we think fitness needs to look like and then what research tells us is actually effective, because our job is to create this ecosystem where people will do it for a long, long time, right? That's the difference between being a HIIT trainer and then being a health coach. It's like you're establishing things that they can continue for a long time. And the research is out. It says that positive emotions related to exercise is the way that people will adhere to a program. It's a longitudinal study. We'll link it in the bio for this episode. And what they found is that if they were able to calibrate the exercise where it was, where the level of fatigue wasn't in excess, where their subjective well-being when they finished this exercise session was high, and where the distress was low, those people were able to not only continue, but to increase, which means our job is to make it like enjoyable for them. Mm-hmm. You want to hear the best way to get somebody to eat right? Tell me all the things that you love to eat. Tell me real food that you love to eat. Go for it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, me.
Yeah.
Blueberries. For sure.
Okay.
Oof. Gosh, what do I like to eat? I'm lame. I really like salmon.
Okay, blueberry salmon.
It's blueberry salmon and zucchini.
Okay, and zucchini.
Yeah, I eat that every day for the last 7 years.
And Marcella, fats are typically something that's found in nuts, seeds, some oils. There's other things that have it. What are some fats that you really like?
Cashews, avocado.
Okay, here's what I want you to do. Salmon, blueberries, cashews, avocado. I want you to eat those every single time that you're hungry. I want you to eat until you're almost full, and then wait a while, and I want you to do that again every time you feel those hunger sensations. That's it. Does that seem like a hard thing to do?
No, I've been doing it for 7 years.
But that's a great example of, hey, let's figure out where somebody already feels autonomous. You're already eating those things. How do I know that? Because you said that you like them. Let's figure out some way that by the time I finish that little prescription, you say, for real? Like, that's it? I've already been doing that. Yes, that's it. And then the next time we check in, be like, did you do it? You're like, yeah, I did do it. Be like, hey, that's awesome. And that little give and take is I think the way that you can create this response to how they perform that feels like they're really successful. Mm-hmm. There's so many things, from having somebody get on an in-body scan to doing all these screens of performance when they already feel like shit, that isn't doing anything to get them to a place where they say, I like this. They like the idea of the outcome, but the process we make really unpleasant. And because we're these weirdos that have somehow reinterpreted these things that aren't very fun as fun, we think, oh, well, everybody else is like that. And it's not actually true. And so I think most people that are coming in, there's already a motivation issue. There's already this deep, deep understanding of the gap that they have to try to overcome. Mm-hmm. And then the first thing we do is like, hey, let's make sure we've really teased out all the ways that you suck. And then I'm going to give you this hard exercise. And then I'm going to tell you to do something that really sucks. I'm going to tell you to eat in a way that makes you wonder if life is worth living. And then I'm going to verbally come in here and make you feel like a piece of shit for not doing it. I'm going to see how many times I can say shit in this episode. That is the industry of fitness. Mm-hmm. That's the game that's being played all over the world. And you wonder why people are fat. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder why it's not very hard to understand why nobody wants to really change if that's the system. Because we're told like, hey, you're a I was going to say a cuss word. My kids might watch this. You're a weenie. You're a real weenie if you can't do all these things. And so if you already struggle with that, you're like, I'm out. I'm not gonna go through this process that just validates the way that I feel already. And then you might even have someone that from a self-control standpoint genetically just wasn't blessed with that ability, right? Their impulse control, their executive functioning, it's not great. And then we're asking them basically something that, with all those other things combined, is literally impossible for them. And we tell them they're the problem.
So I think to tie
land
this
the
all
plane.
together,
Will you land the plane for us here?
I was gonna hit you with one of these. To tie it all in, I mean, you briefly mentioned it, but I think it's a final piece of this puzzle. But when you gave me that really easy prescription and I came back and I got to tell you, yes, sensei, I did what you told me to do, and it was easy, there's a level of accomplishment. Mm-hmm. There's a level of celebration that makes me want to do this again, right? To go back to the story we started off with the lion, I brought it back to the tribe and we celebrated around it, and I no longer feared this lion. That's exactly what this is. I feared exercise. I feared eating this certain way that, like you mentioned, I came in nervous, And now I'm here and I accomplished what you did and we've celebrated together. It makes it easy for me to then do it again and do it again for a long time because I'm no longer fearing this thing. It's so easy. Why wouldn't I? Right. And I think that's the finishing point, is making sure that, one, as a coach, you're making your client successful. And that's finding the right prescription, even if you have to try a couple variations. Because once that level of celebration hits, you've completed that stress cycle. They're ready to take it on again. But if they just keep failing, they're going to hit another stress cycle. They're going to hit another stress cycle. And 6 months later, going to be like, I've gotten 0 results and I don't want to do this anymore.
That's good. I got nothing else to say but that. Way to land the plane.